Today's video is sponsored by Wondrium. So, up until last year, I, for one, hated Christmas. I'm not entirely sure when my childhood excitement was replaced with the dark cynicism I have against the holiday, but for years, I found the entire shift in human nature disingenuous, to say the least, particularly as a child who was heavily bullied at school and didn't have a stable or loving environment growing up. You know, for 11 months of the year, I only witnessed greed, selfishness, and cruelty. And then, for 1 month, people were overcome with this desire to be generous and kind. I received Christmas cards from classmates who tormented me throughout the year, and hugs from relatives that I hadn't seen or heard from since the Christmas prior. To me, the switch in demeanour, which retreated as soon as the clock struck midnight on New Year's Day, was entirely driven by self-serving desires to gain as much as possible through the social pressures of mutual reciprocity. And, if I'm honest, I still stand by my judgment, but I've managed to transform my perspective on the season in a way not too dissimilar from my literary counterpart, Ebeneezer Scrooge. Scrooge is one of the most psychologically credible characters in any work of literature. He, to me, always embodied how I'd experienced people in society. They were self-serving, judgmental, greedy, egoistic, and cared about no one but themselves, except those who could leverage their status. However, I actually respected him because at least he was honest about it. He only cared about himself and his money, and he didn't hide behind any false niceties, performative generosity, and socially contrived seasonal goodwill. And for that, he was actually seen as other. Scrooge is heartless, but he's certainly not two-faced about it, making his end approach and perspective on Christmas the most genuine and trustworthy out of all of those throughout the entire book. His joy isn't driven by superficiality, nor by social performance, such as family gatherings or the pressure to make the season entertainable for children. Scrooge is still alone at the end of the novel, though we don't see him return home after his day of generosity. After feasting with his employees and gifting the town with heartfelt support and charity, Scrooge still goes back to an empty bed, with the memories of the love that he lost and will likely die never knowing. Scrooge has no biological family, nor a partner to come back home to, yet he continues to spread the joy of Christmas all year round, and his motivations are entirely self-driven. What's most fascinating about Scrooge's transformation is Dickens's choice to frame this metamorphosis not through divine inspiration, but through a horror story. Dickens took the pagan symbolism of the spirit of Christmas and turned it into a literal series of seasonal ghosts who haunt Scrooge's consciousness. And though the moral storyline hinges on what is known largely as a Christian holiday, Dickens's spiritual neutrality and lack of heavy religious symbolism are what makes the story so incredibly human, and thus timeless and global. As Brian Saby says, Dickens was deeply interested in the ethics of fiction. As a social commentator, he tried to use fiction to persuade his readers to work for ethical progress in society. In the life of Charles Dickens, John Forster wrote, "Such was Dickens's interest in things supernatural, but for the restraining power of his common sense, he might have fallen into the follies of supernaturalism." You see, in a letter that Dickens wrote, he said, "I do not set myself up to pretend to know what the Almighty's laws are as to disembodied spirits. I do not profess to be free from disagreeable impressions and apprehensions even." Responsive to a skepticism inspired by spiritualist epistemology, Dickens recapitulated the move affected by spiritualism itself. He presents his subjection to internal impressions and apprehensions as an indication of the possible existence of objective and external spirits. And although he would become increasingly hostile to factual claims of spiritualists in his real life, his novels regularly depended upon such uncertain exchange of internal impressions and external apparitions. Much like Hamlet's soliloquy, Scrooge is to be and not to be. He is a man who is haunting and who haunts. Every figure in the book is haunted by his existence, and he resides in a liminal space between his waking life and sleep, life and death, the present, the future, and the past. The ghosts serve as a vehicle for Dickens's narrative cycle, and the use of ghosts is important here. As Brandon Chitwood explains, ghosts saw a surge in critical interest since Jacques Derrida's 1993 Spectres of Marx, which in part served as an elegy or wig for a leftist intelligentsia coming to terms with a world that seemed ready to embrace neoconservative notions of the end of history. In Spectres of Marx, Derrida observed that a ghost begins by coming back. The ghost, in this case, was that of Karl Marx, whose apparent social demise with the fall of the Soviet Union may have been exaggerated, but Marx's role as a ghost that haunts our cultural consciousness for as long as the issues that engaged him remain our own. As long as capitalism exists, Marx's ghost haunts us. And this leads us back to Dickens's ghosts and his misanthropic, capitalistic anti-hero. However, before we get any further, I'd like to thank today's sponsor, Wondrium. Because if you're anything like me and you spend most of your free time learning, or if you're someone who would like to spend more of your free time exploring educational or imaginative content, then you're going to love Wondrium. Wondrium is the premier entertaining and educational video subscription service that enriches your overall life experiences with accessible and fascinating content. Wondrium brings together trusted and inspiring experts and non-fiction storytellers from around the world to create a gallery of curiosities featuring over 6,000 hours of video courses, documentaries and series. If you're tired of consuming mindless content out of habit, then trust me, your brain is going to love this place. Wondrium is where you can find the answer to everything you've ever wondered about and introduce you to things that you've never imagined to wonder about. Their carefully curated collection of short and long-form videos, tutorials, how-tos, travelogues and documentaries are accessibly academic and thoroughly researched, relentlessly entertaining and presented by engaging experts. If you love literature like I do, then I recommend Life Lessons for Great Books. This series actually explores the concepts that I say at the end of my videos. Books save lives, so keep reading. Every important moment in your life, because for every important moment in your life, there is a great book that can give you a unique perspective on your experience. Every book you explore in the course, from The Odyssey to Hamlet and Animal Farm, has a unique expression of human spirit. And Fears shows us how they provide you with a wealth of insight into aspects of your life, from how to conduct yourself in times of trouble to appreciating the simple moments in life. There is now no excuse to procrastinate and waste your time mindlessly scrolling on unfulfilling social media platform news feeds when you could be discovering new passions and diving deeper into your favourites with Wondrium, which is accessible anywhere, whether that's on your mobile phone, your laptop or your TV. What's more, Christmas is coming, and Wondrium makes a fantastic gift for anyone who loves limitless learning. So if you're interested in learning more, then subscribe to the Museum of the Mind today. Wondrium have very kindly offered a free trial to anyone who signs up via my link at wondrium.com/Lady of the Library, which is linked in the description box below. So discover your new favourite place on the internet today, and thank you Wondrium so much for sponsoring today's video. So let's get back into theory and literature, shall we? Derridian ideas of spectrality, or hauntology as he puts it, helps us understand A Christmas Carol a little better. Derrida begins Spectres of Marx with another ghost of an idea. Quote, "Someone, you or me, comes forward and says, 'I would like to learn to live finally.' This hypothetical situation could be Scrooge's own, especially when he pleads to the ghost of Christmas yet to come, stating, 'I will live in the past, the present and the future. The spirits of all three shall strive within me. I will not shut out the lessons that they teach.' Scrooge, by the end of the novel, is ironically taught by ghosts how to live, and his spectral teachers were necessary by Derridian standards. As Derrida wrote, "But to learn to live, to learn it from oneself and by oneself all alone, to teach oneself to live, is that not impossible for a living being? Is it not what logic itself forbids? To live, by definition, is not something one learns, not from oneself. It is not learned from life, taught by life, only from the other and by death. In any case, from the other at the edge of the life. At the internal border or the external border, it is the heterodidactics between life and death." Chitwood elaborates on this beautifully by explaining how Dickens's ghosts, like Derrida's Spectres of Marx, are ontologically figures of repetition. The ghost begins by coming back, and this repetitive nature of hauntology is apparent in the first sentence of A Christmas Carol. Marley was dead, to begin with. In both narrative and grammatical senses, Dickens presents a man's end as a textual beginning. What begins is what has already happened, and what has already occurred is death. Syntactically and semantically, Derrida echoes Dickens's famous opening with his own account of the ontology of the ghost. Quote, repetition and first time, but also repetition and last time, since the singularity of any first time makes of it also a last time. Each time it is an event itself, a first time is a last time. Altogether other. Staging for the end of history. Let us call it hauntology. The meaning of these contradictory statements lies in the spectral gap which occupies the space between the two. What is always already is that which is present/absent, dead or alive, undead. Repetition enacts a crisis between process and event, which becomes an invitation to a haunting, an invocation of the ghost, to be and not be. The chain of interspectral discourses in A Christmas Carol serve as signifiers of death, and as Lacan explains in the seminar, the threat of death is part of what constitutes the power of the signifier. Lacan imagines a plaintive question asked directly to the signifier. What are you, figure of the dice I roll in your chance encounter with my fortune? Nothing, if not the presence of death that makes a human life into reprieve obtained from morning to morning in the name of significations of which your sign is the shepherd's crook. Thus did Scheherazade for 1,001 nights, and thus have I done, experiencing the ascendancy of the sign at the cost of a dizzying series of loaded tosses in a game of even or odd. Signifiers thus have the power to direct fates, and the signifiers of death in Dickens's novels do just that. Many theorists who focus on the ethics of fiction have demonstrated how the ethics within fiction can affect those of the real world. In Love's Knowledge, Nussbaum draws on Dickens along with other authors to show that the novel is, in some ways, a more adequate form for pursuing ethical questions than traditional forms used by philosophers. She asserts that novels and ethical philosophy, to some degree, seek to address the same question, namely, how should one live? In a way that is helpful to the readers. Although Nussbaum concerns herself with the effect of the fictional on the real, she also recognises that the boundary between the two is blurred, partly because the imagination helps construct both. A Christmas Carol rejects the hardline segregation of the real and the imaginary, and takes on what Saby argues is somewhat a Kantian stance, i.e. that the imagination is always involved in meaningful experience. Dickens's work demonstrates that he believed that the realness of the real world is established by its relation to the other, and not by its independence from the imaginative construction. Adam Smith's 1759 book, The Theory of Moral Sentiments, posits that sympathy is fundamentally an act of imaginative identification with another person. In other words, according to Smith, real-world sympathy means imagining real-world people. Quote, how selfish soever man may be supposed, there are evidently some principles in his nature which interest him in the fortune of others, and render their happiness necessary to him. Our senses never did and never carry us beyond our own persons, and it is by the imagination only that we can place ourselves in our brother's situation, and thence from some idea of his sensations. We can see that Dickens believed the imagination enabled sympathy, not only by the nature of Dickens' writing, but by the topics that he covers within the story of Scrooge. It is only when Scrooge sees with his own eyes the dying children, the empty chair of Tiny Tim, and the singing miners, that he imagines a world outside of his own. His imaginative adventures with spirits rekindles his real-world sympathy for his fellow man, which in turn should rekindle our sympathy as readers. The ghost that haunts Scrooge exists on the same ontological level as the narrator, and thus Dickens, and thus us as readers. The ghosts are speaking to us as the author is in our world. We are Scrooge if we don't listen to the same messages. When Scrooge looks at his past, we are evoked to reflect on our own childhoods, and then we are left to visualise our own dreaded futures and confront our graves. The Hauntings of these three ghosts explores ways in which fictions of the imagination are necessary for meaningful engagement with the world. Dickens's choice of ghosts as his personifications of the functional imagination participates in a cultural movement that Terry Castle identifies in the historical shift in the meaning of Phantasmagoria. Quote, "From an initial connection with something external and public, an artificially produced spectral illusion, the word Phantasmagoria has now, over the past 2 centuries, come to refer to something wholly internal or subjective, the phantasmic imagery of the mind. This metaphoric shift bespeaks a very significant transformation in human consciousness, what I shall call the specialization or ghostifying of mental space." As Saby explains, each of Dickens's 3 ghosts represents a different aspect of fictional imagination. The spirit of Christmas Past symbolises memory and shows how Scrooge's suppression of the things that have kept him from understanding his ethical stance, or lack thereof. The ghost of Christmas Present personifies communal imaginings, social fictions cooperatively fabricated that make social harmony possible. The spirit of Christmas Yet to Come embodies the fear of death, but also associates itself with intentions and goals, thus ultimately representing the imaginative effort of informing future fact of death. These 3 spirits reflect a Kantian conceptualization of perception. Kant's productive imagination is also named because it plays a primary role in producing perception, which he terms apperception. Kant posits the imagination as the primary synthetic faculty, making relations across time and space meaningful, and thereby enabling coherent experience. Quote, "The principle of the necessary unity of the pure, productive synthesis of the imagination prior to apperception is thus the ground of possibility of all cognition, especially that of experience." Scrooge's inability to engage with Christmas is due to his imaginative failure to bridge the gap between his past, present, and future self. For him to live a fulfilling, real life, he needs to connect with his fictional self that exists within his memory and his imagination, and his ethical deficiency is down to his inability to imagine what others are going through. What's funny is that the ending of A Christmas Carol is somewhat misleading to our hopeful hearts. We are told that Tiny Tim, despite the vision of the ghost of Christmas Yet to Come, did not die. Though in reality, we know that's not true. Everyone dies in the end, even Scrooge, who cried over the sight of his own gravestone. It's all a reality. The signifiers cannot be undone, no matter how well one lives one's life. However, as George Gaff argues, the display of virtue in the novel is meant to incite imitation and teach judgment to a relatively select audience that has moved to a profound manipulation of the reader's visual sense of what is, in effect, the mass marketing of an ideology about sympathy. Additionally, the spectre of Marx remains at the end of the novel. Capitalism isn't overruled. Scrooge just becomes a good capitalist. The story's ideological project is an attempt to link sympathy and business by incorporating a charitable impulse in the male readers at the time's self-conceptions, underlining an association between charitable feeling and one's participation in society. The culture from which Scrooge has been absent is one of commodity. His failure to participate in human fellowship is signalled by his refusal of, and need to learn, a gift-giving defined as the purchase and exchange of commodities, and thus the story illustrates that the extension of self required by humanist ideology also characterises the capitalist subject's relation to representation. The spirit of Christmas is generosity, which in the book is demonstrated through capitalistic means, as the gift is a physical manifestation of the Christmas spirit. But should this make us so jaded about the book, or Christmas in general? I don't think it would be fair to become disheartened by this analysis. After all, Scrooge is confined by the limits of his reality. He cannot escape capitalism or death. but the heterodidactics of life and death taught him how to live within these restraints. Though one could argue Scrooge's generosity reifies the capitalism which causes the suffering that he saw within the visions of dying and starving children who were trapped in workhouses, the mythopoetic conflation of Christmas and capitalism depicted in the novel proposes that one cannot avoid the game entirely. It must be played. One can recode capitalism, but in doing so, one still reifies it. This hauntingly social narrative that Dickens created culturally broadened the concept of Christmas around the world and took it beyond a religious festival and framework to one that permeates every culture capitalism touches. It's no secret that Dickens held disdain for utilitarian thoughts and had a strong aversion to elaborate theological systems. But Dickens's novel teaches us that we can choose how to play the cards we're given in the game that we're often forced to play. But the emphasis is on choice. We are perpetually haunted by signifiers we can't escape, but we can choose how to read them and respond to them. As Jaff writes, the reader-spectator who identifies with the Christmas spirit identifies with a culture in which that spirit will always be necessary. The self, as the image, is a renewable self, forever holding out the possibility of a new ending. Such an interpretation depends on the idea not that the story has no effect on the external world, but only that such an effect is never conceived as an ending. It is, rather, part of a cycle to which the story's own representation, now a part of the culture it represents, also belongs. Thank you so much for watching today's video. I hope you found it enjoyable, and if you did, please consider liking this video, subscribing, leaving a wee comment, and also checking out today's video sponsor, Wondrium. It's actually a really cool website. I highly recommend it. There's a lot of things on there. It's like I've used it for the Great Courses audiobooks a lot in the past, so it was lovely to be sponsored by Wondrium. So thank you again, Wondrium, for sponsoring today's video, and I shall see you soon for another video. And remember, books save lives, so keep reading.